So, good evening from Piraeus here in Greece. It's a great pleasure tonight in our IPT Talk series to have with us Dr. Gabriel Martino from Buenos Aires. He's going to speak on a very interesting topic related to Plotinus' philosophy of mind. The title of his talk is In Potency and in Actuality. He's going to offer a discussion of dialectical and psychological aspects of Plotinus' theory of mind. A few words about Gabriel Martino, who is also a good friend from Buenos Aires in Argentina. He has completed his PhD and postdoctoral studies in Buenos Aires, but also in Rutgers University under the Fulbright Scholarship. He's an associate researcher of the National Research Council and a visiting research associate here with us at the Institute of Philosophy and Technology. He is teaching interdisciplinary topics, great interesting intersections of the Sanskrit, ancient Greek, history of ancient and late ancient philosophy, and Indian philosophy. And he has published a number of books and articles on Indian, Greek, and the comparative philosophy. Just indicative are the short history of yoga and the Enneatic mysticism related to Plotinus and genealogy analysis and comparison. And on a personal note, our common work, a volume that we are working on, Jorge Luis Borges and ancient Greek philosophy. We are editing this volume and hopefully in the following years is going to be published. Gabriel, you're very welcome and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank to the Institute of Philosophy and Technology for accepting me as a visiting research associate. And also I would like to thank you, Professor Giannis Stamatelos and to Phaedra Alevisu for organizing this talk. And to all of you who are present today, who have registered to the talk, thanks as well for your attention and for being present. Thank you for the presentation as well. And well, it's a great honor and pleasure for me as well to share this talk with you and to be able to have this exchange, hopefully at the end of the exposition about the topic that we are going to discuss today. So the idea is that I'm going to read a short paper, as you said, which has the title In Potency and in Actuality. So I'm going to share the document. Please let me know if you can see the document correctly and if you can hear me properly. Can you see the document?
I can see the document and we can hear you. I hope that all the participants agree with this.
Great. So I'm going to set the chronometer on to see, to just have an idea of the time. And well, I'm going to start reading, and if you need to interrupt me, please don't hesitate to stop me and say or ask what you need to. Well, so in Potency and in Actuality, a discussion of dialectical and psychological aspects of Plotinus's philosophy of mind. In his book, The Inner Truth, Gavin Flood examines and compares the notions of interiority as they are articulated in certain moments and authors of Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism. But in its opening pages, at the beginning of its introductory description of the notion of interiority in Christianity, Flood refers to Plotinus with the following words. The first epigraph above from Plotinus reflects a classical view derived from Plato that there is a higher reality, a unitary truth, from which the proliferation and multiplicity of the world derives or emanates. This truth is found within the self, and through contemplation, through turning away from the world, the person can realize the beauty of the truth within, which is the source and origin of us all. With Plotinus, we need to turn to the self to perceive the unchanging inner beauty of its nature and authentic truth. So we believe, along with Flawed, that in the Enneads we find what we could call the birth of interiority for the history of Western philosophy. And we will argue in the present talk that the articulation of such a conception goes hand in hand with the doctrine of the undescended soul, one of Plotinus's most original theories. This birth, however, does not arise out of nothing, but can be understood as one of the innovations that Plotinus introduces into the Platonic tradition on the basis of developments that preceded our philosopher. Just as the doctrines of the transcendence of the first principle, the one, and the relation of it with mind or intellect, as nous is usually translated, have long been understood as consequences of the hermeneutical practice to which Plotinus was devoted, the Plotinian innovation that gives rise to interiority can also be understood in this direction. With regard to the precedents mentioned, in what follows we will make a brief reference to Alcinous Didaskalikos. A quick review of this treatise will allow us to show that prior to Plotinus, the Platonic tradition had identified in Plato's thought two discordant models concerning the relationship of man with the intelligible. Taking this into account, the aspects of Plotinus's thought that we examine here appear to us as an attempt to resolve this tension, and as a universalist resolution and not exclusivist, as we shall see. So now we are going to present very briefly these two discordant models, analyzing the Didaskalikos. We must begin emphasizing that we have no evidence that Plotinus ever read the Didaskalikos, nor in fact who read it in antiquity. However, we can affirm, along with specialists, that the manual was based on a multiplicity of circulating sources that had already reached a certain systematic exposition of the doctrines of Plato, and that the very fact that the text was transmitted as a didactic exposition shows that it delineates a moderately established way of reading Plato. The philosophical conceptions that the text offers, and as proper to Plato, can therefore be regarded as elements with which Plotinus engages in dialogue and which he reworks in his treatises. Alcinous dedicates the fourth chapter of his work to the exposition of the epistemological theory, which, according to his particular interpretation, is one of the aspects of the dialectical part of philosophy. There he distinguishes the reason of the god from that of man, and then divides the human faculty into two, giving these variants the names scientific reason and opinion-based reason. The former, the scientific one, is related to the primary intelligibles. Concerning the apprehension of these intelligibles, Alcinous says the following. Intellection is the activity of the intellect as it contemplates the primary objects of intellection. There seem to be two forms of this. The one prior to the soul's coming to be in this body, when it is contemplating by itself the objects of intellection. The other after it has been installed in this body. Of these, the former, that which existed before the soul came to be in the body, is called intellection in the strict sense, while once it has come to be in the body, what was then called intellection is now called natural conception, being as it were an intellection stored up in the soul. So when we say that intellection, when we say that intellection is the first principle of scientific reasoning, we are not referring to what is now called this, but rather to that which existed when the soul was apart from the body, which, as we said, was in that context called intellection, but in its present state is called natural conception. The natural concept is called by Plato, simple item of knowledge, the wing of the soul, and sometimes memory. We can see that Alcinous states that the direct contemplation of the ideas, which takes place prior to the soul's descent into the body, is intellection in the strict sense. But he also maintains that once it is in the body, the soul has instead another kind of intellection, though related to the first, which he calls natural notion or conception, and which he assimilates to Plato's doctrine of reminiscence. Further in the treatise, in the 10th chapter devoted to the third principle of Plato's theology, that is to say, the God, Alcinous sets forth a conception that seems to be in conflict with the one we have just described. Let us quote the relevant passage. The third way of conceiving him is the following one. One contemplates first beauty in bodies, then after that turns to the beauty in soul, then to that in customs and laws, and then to the great sea of beauty, after which one gains an intuition of the good itself and the final object of love and striving, like a light appearing and, as it were, shining out to the soul which ascends in this way. And along with this one also intuits God, in virtue of his preeminence in honor. This passage belongs to the systematic exposition of what has come to be known as the three paths that lead to the knowledge of God, paths also present in Plotinus. The third path mentioned here clearly refers to the symposium and to the ascent in the contemplation of beauty that begins with beauty in bodies, then proceeds to beauty in the soul, and afterward to beauty in laws and customs. Such an ascent would make it possible eventually to contemplate the great ocean of beauty. Alcinous adds that after the said contemplation, the good itself will be intellectually apprehended as the object of desire, thus complementing the description in the Symposium with elements from the Republic and even of Aristotelian origin. The passage also resonates with the 7th letter attributed to Plato. Alcinous thus provides a synthesis of the ascent described in the Symposium, integrating it with notions drawn from other texts, not only from Plato, according to which man ultimately comes to intellectually apprehend the good itself and to attain an understanding of the God. It should be recalled, however, that Alcinous had affirmed in the previously discussed 4th chapter that man is not capable of attaining the contemplation of the ideas while embodied. It is not our intention to resolve this problematic issue present in the Didaskalikos, or in Plato, nor to offer our own reading of Plato's dialogues that would undo or solve Alcinous' interpretative difficulty. Our analysis does allow us to affirm, however, that Middle Platonism had already developed, prior to Plotinus, two parallel interpretative syntheses based on different sources concerning the relationship between man and the intelligible, and that Plotinus draws on and reworks both of them. Very good. So now we're going to address the Plotinian solution involving the undescended soul and the birth of inner realities. We know that Plotinus began to set down his philosophical doctrines in writing only at the age of 50. This leads us to think that the first pages of Plotinus should not be regarded as the result of a casual event. His first written words, as we shall see, place us squarely within the context of Plato's Symposium. And by means of quite explicit allusions to this dialogue, Plotinus seeks to determine whether there exists something beyond beautiful things, that is, the idea of beauty. Within the framework of this inquiry, he states, the soul then, when it is purified, becomes form and an expressed principle, and entirely incorporeal and intellectual and wholly divine, which is the source of beauty and of all things that have a kinship with it. So then, being born up to intellect, becomes even more beautiful, and intellect and the things that come from intellect are soul's beauty, since they belong to it. That is, they are not alien to it, because it is then really soul alone. In this brief passage, we find an answer to the question already mentioned at the beginning of the treatise, but also an indication of Plotinus's position concerning the epistemological dissonance we find in the Didaskalikos, and which we are interested in examining in this talk. Thus, already in his first treatise, written as a kind of free commentary to the Symposium, Plotinus sets forth his view according to which the soul can ascend toward intellect, that the beauty of intellect is not foreign to the soul, and that becoming divine must be understood as the soul's becoming beautiful, or even the beautiful. The conception of the contemplation of intellect and its beauty is developed in several later writings and finds its fullest expression in Treatise 5.8. with the title On Intelligible Beauty. Now, Alcinous had acknowledged the possibility that the soul might apprehend the ideas directly, but only in its state free from the body, such that there was an alternation between two kinds of contemplation, direct and indirect, depending on whether the soul was without a body or embodied. Similarly, Plotinus also recognizes this alternation, although he interprets it differently, as we can see in the following passage. For some souls, such an experience takes place little by little and in a temporal sequence, and their reversion towards the better takes place in a milieu which is worse. And if, against the belief of others, one is to venture to express more clearly one's own view, the fact is that even our own soul does not descend in its entirety, but there is something of it always in the intelligible world. However, if that part which is in the sensible world becomes dominant, or rather if it is dominated and subjected to disturbance, it does not permit there to be self-awareness in us of that of which the upper part of the soul is in contemplation. As we can see, our philosopher holds that man can exercise the contemplation of the ideas directly, even while embodied. But for him, this contemplation is not perpetual. Rather, it is intermittent and temporary. This is possible, according to Plotinus, because there is something in the soul that always remains in the intelligible realm, and because even while the soul is in a body, there is something of it always in the intelligible world. Nevertheless, man is not always aware of what the higher part of the soul contemplates, since he allows himself to be dominated and disturbed by the sensible realm. It is interesting to note that this doctrine of the undescended soul, which makes possible an embodied contemplation of the ideas, departs manifestly from what is described in the myth of the Phaedrus, if the latter is taken literally. Plotinus himself acknowledges that this theory goes against the common opinion, and indeed it has provoked among both ancient and modern interpreters very diverse assessments. Hermias and Proclus, for example, regarded the Plotinian doctrine as a novelty and opposed it. Philoponus, for his part, thought that Plotinus departed from Plato in holding it, and Porphyry also initially rejected it. Rist, on the one hand, considers the doctrine to be essentially Platonic, though he likewise calls it a novel theory. And Schlesak asserts that with this doctrine, Plotinus does not diverge from Plato, but rather from other ancient interpreters who failed to bring to light what Plato had truly indicated. Setting aside, however, the question of the reception of the Plotinian doctrine, the doctrine itself involves the problem that the soul possesses a part which is engaged in contemplation, while the human being is nevertheless unaware of it. Plotinus recognizes how striking this conception is and addresses the problem. Since then there is soul that engages in calculative reasoning about just and beautiful things, that is calculative reasoning that seeks to know if this is just or if this is beautiful, it is necessary that there exist permanently something that is just, from which the calculative reasoning in the soul arises. How else could it engage in calculative reasoning? And if soul sometimes engages in calculative reasoning about these things and sometimes does not, there must be intellect that does not engage in calculative reasoning, but always possesses justice. How then, given that we have such great things in us, do we not grasp them, but rather are mostly inactive with respect to these activities? Some people are altogether inactive. They are always involved with their own activities, I mean intellect, and that which is prior to intellect and internally in itself, and soul as well, which is thus always moving. For not everything in soul is immediately sensible, but it comes to us whenever it comes to our sense perception. In this new passage, Plotinus presents, in the form of a dialogue with an imaginary interlocutor, elements that complete his doctrine of the undescended soul. Since we reason about justice or about just actions, he says, there must be an idea of justice by virtue of which we reason. And since we possess a reasoning faculty that exercises its function, there must be a power that always has available the canon of justice, so that the soul, in turn, may reason by taking it as its measure. The interlocutor, for his part, expresses surprise at this assertion, and Plotinus explains that although intellect is always engaged in the contemplation of the idea of justice, man, or we, are not always conscious of this activity. This passage allows us to understand then that the transitoriness of the direct contemplation of the idea should not be attributed to the power of intellect, but rather to man as a whole. A few lines later in the same chapter, Plotinus states this clearly. Further, each of the parts of the soul, always alive, is always acting by itself with its own object. But cognizing occurs whenever transmission, that is, apprehension, occurs. So, if there is going to be apprehension of things present in this way, then that which is to be apprehended, that is to apprehend, the subject, that which is to apprehend, must revert inward and focus its attention there. Plotinus holds that the intellective power of man is always engaged in its contemplative activity of the idea, and that because a part of the soul never descends from intellect, even while in the body, the soul can attain the direct contemplation of the idea. But in order to achieve such contemplation, that is, for man to be able to communicate with the undescended part of the soul and to perceive what it contemplates, it is necessary to turn inward. As we can see, Plotinus projects the intelligible reality into the interior of man and reinterprets the Platonic separation between the sensible and the intelligible realms in terms of interiority. The path to the intelligible realm and to the apprehension of the intellection of the form is hence a path within. The realm of interiority, however, is not that of an individual and historical subjectivity, but, as Flot says, that of a shared and stable truth. Plotinus himself expresses this. But how are we related to the intellect? By intellect, I do not mean that condition that the soul derives from the entities that accompany the intellect, but the intellect itself. In fact, we have this even though it transcends us, but we have it either collectively or individually, or both collectively and individually. We have it collectively because it is indivisible and one, that is everywhere identical. We have it individually because each one of us has the whole of it in the primary part of the soul. We have the forms, then, in two ways. In the soul, in a way, unfolded and separated, but in intellect altogether. This last passage makes it clear that the intellect to which man can gain access through the undescended soul, once he turns inward, is the same intellect for all, and that the contemplation in which one person may participate is the same contemplation in which another may participate. Thus, the interiority advocated by Plotinus is far from aligning with any form of subjectivism, but it also stands opposed to exclusivism, since the philosopher emphatically declares that intellect is one and everywhere identical. Regarding this last aspect of the Enneatic philosophy that we're going to discuss, we can add that Narbonne affirms it is a key element in Plotinus's polemic against the Gnostics, insofar as it aims to refute the soteriological doctrine of that philosophical religious group. The scholar notes that the aforementioned doctrine of the undescended soul rests on two key ideas. First, the notion of the kinship or affinity of the human soul with the divine, and second, the idea of the similarity or consubstantiality of both realities. The first notion, Narbonne argues, belongs to classical Platonism and does not entail a significant innovation. The second, on the contrary, is foreign to Plato's thought and represents a major innovation. This consubstantiality of the Platonian soul, moreover, makes it akin to the Gnostic Hermetic soul and ensures its possibility of returning to its source. Yet the key difference between the Gnostic and Platonian conceptions, Narbonne observes, lies in the fact that for the Gnostics, only a certain group of human souls, the pneumatic ones, possess this nature, whereas for Plotinus, consubstantiality belongs to at least a part of the souls of all human beings. Thus, though inspired by Gnostic ideas, the universality of Plotinus's proposal would contradict, according to Narbonne, the exclusivism of that school's doctrine of salvation, and places all human souls in the same condition with respect to their relation to the divine. The final lines of the passage also include a statement that allows us in turn to better understand Plotinus's solution to the tension between the two epistemological models derived from Plato and found at the beginning of our talk, formulated in the Didaskalikos. If Alcinous' treatise held, on the one hand, that the embodied soul could contemplate the ideas only indirectly, as natural notions present in the soul and through recollection, but then, in commenting on the Symposium, seemed to suggest that the contemplation of the idea of the beauty was also possible, Plotinus accepts both kinds of contemplation. Yet, in Plotinus, these are not contradictory or conflicting proposals. Rather, one form of contemplation is subordinated to and made possible by the other. Furthermore, the presence of the notion of justice in the reasoning soul must be understood, so to speak, as the result of the presence of the idea of justice in intellect, and the bond connecting one level to the other is twofold. The doctrine of procession accounts for the causal link that the ideas has with the logos present in the soul. The possibility that man, even while embodied, can contemplate the very content of the intellect is made possible, as we have said, by the conception of the undescended soul. As we have seen, Plotinus's philosophy masterfully integrates textual exegesis, epistemological inquiry, psychological theorization, and religious response. His doctrine of the undescended soul resolves the tension present in middle Platonic conceptions of the relationship between man and the intelligible, while at the same time marking the emergence of a new mode of access to the divine, one that takes place through the inward turn. By locating the intelligible realm within the depths of the soul and affirming that a part of it never descends, Plotinus transforms the Platonic ascent into a process of interiorization and unification. Interiority thus becomes the privileged site of metaphysical realization, where the human and the divine coincide in contemplative activity. At the same time, this inner path is universal and non-exclusive, against the Gnostic conception of a salvation reserved for a spiritual elite. Plotinus conceives the openness of the soul toward intellect as a shared condition of all human beings. This relationship, which implies that intellect is eternally engaged in the contemplation of the forms, nevertheless requires actualization if man is to become conscious of it. As Narbonne has also shown, this universal soteriology, in which every person, by turning inward, may gain that consciousness, implies the consubstantiality of soul and intellect. The birth of interiority in the Enneads, therefore, entails not a withdrawal into subjectivity, but an opening toward a universal mind that grounds all existence as well as the truth within. Thank you very much.
Very interesting talk, and really how it summarizes Plotinus' philosophy of mind in relation to his psychology. Indeed, Plotinus' theory of the soul is a very important contribution in ancient Greek philosophy, and really a question to really understand when he describes the soul, the psyche, as an amphibian nature, and the expression of this beautiful metaphor of the amphibious, that soul at the same time participates in the intelligible realm and the physical realm, and how this dual participation has various implications in philosophical terms, and of course in modern considerations of how human beings experience the different kinds of the self, as higher self and the lower self. But I would like to ask for any questions from our audience. You're very welcome. Maybe we can have to give some more time. And I would like to ask a question, and I'm really tempted, Gabriel, because of your expertise and your background in Indian philosophy and other traditions. I wonder if, excluding the direct reference to the Platonic tradition, Alcinous and whatever you have mentioned so far, if this undescended theory of Plotinus' soul could have any reference to any other tradition. So one interpretation is that he's giving a legitimate interpretation of Plato's original teaching. Another interpretation, the second one, is that there is a novel theory that the Platonists have identified. I wonder if there is a third one, that some other influences might be observed directly or indirectly in Plotinus' thought.
Well, thank you very much, Janice, for your question. We have Narbonne's intervention there, no? And he says that in a way, this notion has or can be thought as inspired by Hermetic Gnostic conceptions of the soul, huh? But not of every soul, but of the pneumatic souls. So we have there an interlocutor within the broader frame of the ancient Western Greek tradition, but at least according to Plotinus, external to the Platonic tradition, no? Now, given that you asked me if maybe I can relate this to Indian theories, well, it's difficult because it's difficult to make an analogy that preserves the terms of the discussion in Plotinus's thought, because we have first of all a division between the sensible and the intelligible, which it's not very easy to find in Indian thought. And secondly, because the conception of the soul in Plotinus and in the Platonic tradition has some parallels, but not exactly, no, in the Indian tradition in different conceptions. Because, for example, we have the notion of the Atman in Indian tradition, but this Atman, at least in classical Samkhya, which is maybe the earliest formulation of this theory, doesn't involve thinking or contemplating. It's just a pure self, and the intellectual activities belong to a different faculty, which it's more related to matter and subject to change than having a strong relationship with the Atman itself. So it's not quite easy to make or to establish that some theory could be parallel, no, in Indian thought, and moreover that theory could have influenced Plotinus. Besides, it's difficult to know in which way that theory could have influenced Plotinus. Even if it existed, how could have Plotinus have gained knowledge about that theory? You know, okay, we know that maybe he tried to travel to India, but he didn't have access to Sanskrit texts, Brahmanical texts, or Buddhist texts. Maybe he talked with a translator. So it's not very easy to try to establish a connection between a very precise doctrine with something that it's maybe from Plotinus's point of view, something quite vague, which would be for him the Indian tradition of thought. So maybe the Gnostic Hermetic influence, or I don't like very much speaking of influence. I think that he read the texts and he found in those texts answers. So it's more an active procedure rather than an influence, which seems to be more like a passive affection of the interpreter. And he found in that conception of the soul good answers for his epistemological and psychological questions, no, and the issues that he found in the previous Platonic tradition.
Very interesting approach. Yes, sometimes we prefer the more clear reference to what is obvious, following Occam's razor, and say what is the simplest answer is try to explain Plotinus' theory of the undescended part of the soul, which is really striking in ancient Greek philosophical tradition within the Platonic tradition. My question, and I know this is not very easy to be justified, and perhaps there are many other things that we cannot really understand right now, we don't know at this moment, is that we have this very beautiful Ennead 4:8, which actually describes this journey of the soul from intellect to the mind. There are some lines where Plotinus expresses his own personal experience, which is a form of ascending the soul, realizing the higher origins of the soul as part of nous. So, and then you have an Ennead which is full of his precursors. So there's also references to Plato, to some pre-Socratics and Pythagoreans. So I think that he realizes some way that there is a kind of novelty. And he tries to justify, because of this nature of this Ennead that is very original, and there are so many references to the ancient Greek philosophical tradition, but also these personal lines of his deification experience makes it more striking, and someone could ask that, yes, perhaps there might be also a reference to something else. So thank you for your clarifications, and I agree that it's very interesting to see how far this part of the undescended soul and the potency and actuality that the soul's intellect and the higher intellect are actually have this capacity could be explained within the Platonic tradition. So we have an exegetical issue and of course a sociological aspect in terms of the salvation that you mentioned, how Plotinus wants to keep this idea for all humans, not exclusively to some higher an elite, that they have an access to a higher form of intellection. I wonder if there are there is any question related to this, or if there are any comments. Yes, Mr. Robotis.
Yeah, actually, I have a question, but not directly related to your question before. Yeah, so you mentioned
yes, of course, you're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. This consubstantiality between soul and intellect, which understand that it means that human soul is across two hypostases, the intellect and soul proper. And I'm wondering, so in this particular case, then you don't have only causal relationships between the various hypostases. You have things that go across. And I'm wondering, is that the only example in the system that you have something that goes across two hypostases, or there are other things? Oh, I think you're muted. You're still muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much for your question. I think it's a very interesting and important question. And I think we could answer at least from two perspectives, no? On the one hand, Plotinus speaks of three hypostases, no? Distinctively, but we should not consider these hypostases as one cut off from the other. No, there is continuity between them. So in a sense, every lower hypostasis is in contact with the higher hypostasis, and this contact is explained in Plotinus in different terms. No, one of these terms is the use of the analogy of vision, or the metaphor of vision. So there is vision of every lower hypostasis of its higher hypostasis. So no hypostasis is cut off from other hypostasis, no? On the other hand, this theory of the undescended part of the soul is, as we say, a theory, no, in which Plotinus will take some time and some pages to develop, because he is interested, especially interested in allowing man, the human being, to gain access to the intelligible. No, so there are like two perspectives. One is the cosmic perspective, and the other one is the personal human perspective. From the cosmic perspective, there is no limitation, I would say, for considering the whole system as a continuum. But from the human perspective, there is a limitation, which is mainly the fact of consciousness. We have the one within us, we have intellect within us, we have soul within us, but we have consciousness of maybe one or maybe another, and usually the lower parts of this system, the nature, the natural world. So how can we gain access, conscious access, to a hypostasis which metaphysically is not really separate from the whole continuum, but for our consciousness it is really separated or isolated, up there. So I think that this theory, it's like a passage to allow the self, really, the self, to ascend from being conscious of the natural world, and then of the soul, and then of the intellect. So I would say that it has an anthropological finality, this theory. And so the important aspect there is to guarantee the access to the intelligible, because the intelligible is the source of real knowledge, eternal knowledge. So I would say that. But maybe Janice or any other of our attendees would like to add something or complete my answer.
I think that I'm really fond of the anthropological reading of Plotinus, and he wants, I fully agree with you, to highlight the importance of the human soul and the possibility of the human soul to ascend, when he refers to the inner man and the outer man, and of course the priority to contemplate by using this inner man, the inwardness, which is very important for Plotinus, and ascending without reference to something which is external, maybe the obvious, the other way around, that to focus on what is truly ours in many cases. So I fully agree that there is a psychological, in terms of ontology in this aspect. There are cosmic elements, there are metaphysical elements, if we want to group all them together, but there is also this anthropological element that makes Plotinus very interesting, how there is no need for salvation, as we can conclude. We are already saved. So the only thing is to discover this higher part of ourselves, in this undescended part, in intellect. So for me, this, as you beautifully mentioned, anthropological element in Plotinus' thought, in his own philosophy of mind, that is really manifested through the different levels of consciousness, described from the sensible to the intelligible, even to a highest form of solitude in enosis with the one. This shows a vision about humanity and the human being for Plotinus, and of course for other living beings around. And you mentioned also in the third way the reference to Eros, to the Platonic love, and the reference to the symposium, which is also part of the Alcinous. I think that this is, at the end of the day, the reference. I think that this is Eros that leads the soul higher to the intelligible beauty by following different steps of beauty in recognizing in bodies, in souls and minds and other things. So I think there is indeed an anthropological reading in these parts of the image that emphasizes anthropos with its inner form, And thank you very much for underlying this through this part of the antecedent and this beautiful question by Mr. Robotis about that.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Yes, it was a very a key question, really, that actually revealed this importance in Plotinus thought. We have a few minutes, if you like, to have any other question. There is a written, let me read this one, Gabriel. So you can read it also in the notes, but let me help you. Can you say how this transforms Aristotle's active intellect, of course? Also, I wonder how much Plotinus influenced Augustine of Hippo notions of interiority in the soul, exhibited in his invention of confessional autobiography, and whether Augustine's interiority may be less subjective and strictly individual than is often imagined, having rather more a shared, common, unifying and objective ground along the lines you draw here. Yes, I think that there's two very big issues here. First, the Aristotelian active and the passive intellect, but also the later echoes of Plotinus thought in Augustine and his inwardness.
Okay, well, thank you very much for these questions. I think I have to think a little bit how to answer, especially the first one, because the second one, I would say that well, my knowledge of Augustine is very limited now, and although I acknowledge that Plotinus has a great influence in Augustine, and well, I've read authors who speak about this. I haven't really studied it deeply, Augustine's philosophy, so I wouldn't address in detail this question. But about Aristotle's active intellect, well, I think we have several problems now, even with the notion of the active intellect in Aristotle. What is the active intellect? And there are some questions that Aristotle himself doesn't answer regarding the active intellect, no? If it comes from outside, and what bearing does this active intellect have on the individuality? I think that there could be different lines of interpretation regarding this issue. We could say on first place that Plotinus is a great reader of Aristotle. Yeah, the whole Neoplatonic tradition is really an Aristotelian tradition. No, in late antiquity, Aristotelianism survives thanks to Neoplatonism. The great commentators after Alexander are Neoplatonic, and the same Plotinus, even if he doesn't write commentaries, he's a great reader and interpreter of Aristotle. Even maybe his central theory, the theory of the nous, is deeply indebted to Aristotle. And in Plotinus himself, we have this theory of the generation of intellect, and how there is a first moment in the intellect when we have a potential intellect or intellect in potency, and then this intellect is actualized and we have the active intellect. No, so here we can see that Plotinus plays a little bit with Aristotelian theory, inverting the terms of his own theory, because though this discourse on the generation of intellect, I think at least that we should take it metaphorically or allegorically, not as a real theory that describes a real process. When explaining this issue of the generational intellect, he inverts the terms, no? Positing firstly the potential or impotency intellect, and then the active intellect. Now, how does this theory of the undescended soul transform Aristotle's active intellect? Well, I think this deserves some serious thought. I think we should say, well, first, how it transforms Plotinus's reception of Aristotle's theory of intellect, no? Because why would it transform Aristotle's theory? No, I think it doesn't transform Aristotle's theory, but it transforms his own interpretation of Aristotelian nous. Janice, would you like to say something so I can think a little bit about it?
I think that you have explained it very well. There is this reference indeed to the Aristotelian corpus, and indeed the active intellect could be somehow related to the higher part, the active part of Plotinus' intellect, more close to contemplation and noesis, and the passive one related to the lower part of Diania, which is also, I would say, goes back to Plato and the terminology of Plato's philosophy of mind. So there is indeed an attempt of Plotinus to reformulate the active and the passive intellect, even starting from the one as dunamis pandon, as an active potency. So even if you see that Plotinus system is a novelty in itself, in order to explain the problems of Plato's Parmenides, but also some questions that Aristotle has raised. So I think it's a very beautiful synthesis with a new way of reading Plato and Aristotle, because Plotinus knew Aristotle very well, and as we know from Porphyry, and we can see in the Enneads, even if he has only 4 direct references to Aristotle's name, it is full of metaphysics and his ethics, of course, even in a critical manner, but in some ways incorporated in his work. So we have this synthesis of Plato and Aristotle reconciled in the Enneads. But it's really it's a huge question, and I think that there are many different parts of the Enneads that actually can show that the active and passive intellect of Aristotle's have various forms of expression in Plotinus metaphysics. And I think that a key figure in the thinker actually in antiquity that influences Plotinus, or let's say there are some interpretations there, just not to keep influence, the passive term of the term influence, is Alexander of Aphrodisias. Actually, we can see there an Aristotle being transmitted, explained, and Plotinus knew Alexander's work. So this is a huge question, and indeed this undescended part of the soul and the metaphysics and ontology of the soul in Plotinus really shows his knowledge and the questions that are open in ancient Greek philosophical tradition about the mind and the soul. We have run almost out of time. Actually, they are so crucial and big questions, and thank you for all these very beautiful questions. And there is a note from Deborah Nass. Should one really claim that the metaphysics of Plato and Aristotle are merely reconciled in Platonian metaphysics, or does he go beyond both systematically? I don't know, Gabriel. I think that he goes beyond I think that this is what he's not only traditionalist, Plotinus. He's explaining the ancients, the Palei, and he goes further, not only about Plato and Aristotle, but also he mentions the pre-Socratics or pre-Platonists, if you like this term, and also some other, the Stoics. So I think that we have this beautiful synthesis, an amalgamation of the different theories, but with a new perspective, with a new novelty, with the novelty of a philosopher who is not just a historian of ancient Greek thought, but a thinker in this term. But I don't know if Gabriel wants to note on this.
Yes, of course, I agree with you, Janis. And there's a very interesting passage in Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, where Porphyry, I think he recounts a commentary by, not a written commentary, but a comment by Longinus, or Longinus. And this writer classifies Platonic writers in three classes, no? And the third class is, which includes Plotinus, involves writers who not only systematize or sum up the writings of the previous thinkers, but that go beyond and address the problems with an open mind, let's say, no? So I think that this notion that Plotinus is an original thinker was present even in ancient times, no? In his own time. And this also speaks to us about what to be a Platonist in ancient times was. No? Being a Platonist in ancient times is not merely commenting or trying to explain Plato's texts, but trying to think about certain problems, epistemological problems, ethical problems, psychological problems, from a Platonic perspective. No? So what is this Platonic perspective? Well, we have great authors writing what is Platonism, no? Is Plato a Platonist? And one of the broad answers that we have about this is that Platonism is a top-bottom perspective, and which tries to explain what we have here in the sensible realm from higher realms. And this higher realm is not only psychical, so which would be what Stoics would say, but intellectual, and intellect even has a higher foundation. So, well, I think that Plotinus goes beyond his previous predecessors, but at the same time belongs to a tradition and manages to fall within the limits, broad limits of what Platonism is and what Platonism was even for ancient thinkers.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. I think I fully agree, and really this is a very interesting reference, and also I think that an implication of our talk. So immediately we see that this discussion of potency, actuality, the descent, undescended part of the soul brings also the problem of sources, or the question of sources, which I don't think it's a problem in itself. I think the question of sources and how Plotinus acts in this way as a philosopher, not as a philologist like Longinus, as indeed there is this anecdote. And as you beautifully mentioned in this case, so even for Porphyry, Plotinus was an original thinker, and perhaps this is the case, using the material of the ancients in his own innovative way. I'm afraid we have to end our beautiful conversation here. I would like deeply to thank Gabriel Martino for his insights, his research, and his really interesting contributions in our topic and beyond this topic, discussion and conversation today. And I would like to thank you all very much about your contribution, your presence, and your attention tonight. Thank you so much and good night. Bye.
Thank you very much to you, Janice, and to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. It's a great pleasure. Thank you. It's an honor for us.